Welcome to The Explainer. All right, today we are putting an adaptation on trial. We're talking about Baz Luhrmann's, explosive, controversial, and totally dazzling take on F. Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece, The Great Gatsby.
So how do you even begin to film a dream? I mean, that's the central problem here, right? The Great Gatsby, it's not just a story, it's a mood. It's all built on, the smoke and mirrors of memory, the quiet loneliness of its narrator, and language so beautiful it's almost impossible to capture on camera.
And for years, a lot of people, critics, filmmakers, they saw the book as just that, a ghost. I mean, think about it. The most important stuff happens in the spaces between the words, right inside Nick Carraway's head. So the big question is, how on earth do you point a camera at that?
And yet, in 2013, Baz Luhrmann didn't just give it a shot. He went all in. His version wasn't just some movie. It was a global cultural event. We're talking a massive budget, a huge box office return, and yeah, a couple of Oscars for its absolutely stunning, if maybe a little overwhelming visual design.
But here's a thought. What if being faithful to the page was never really the point? What if Luhrmann's movie isn't supposed to be a history lesson, but more like a translation of a traumatic memory? A chaotic, loud, heartbreaking fever dream. That's the whole idea we're going to dig into today. That this isn't a literal adaptation, it's a translation of how someone remembers something. So let's start with the film's biggest, and I mean biggest, departure from the book.
Okay, so right out of the gate, Luhrmann makes this massive change to the entire structure of the story. And it all comes down to where our narrator, Nick Carraway, is when he's telling us everything.
Okay, so in the novel, Nick is looking back, right? He's cynical, sure, but he's composed. He's got some distance. Luhrmann's Nick? Oh, he is a complete wreck. He's in a sanitarium. He's being treated for alcoholism, anger issues, and he's writing the whole story down as therapy. What this does is it basically takes all his internal trauma and puts it right out there on the screen. It shifts him from this, complicated, maybe even complicit observer into a much more sympathetic victim.
And this whole framing device, it does something really fascinating. By making Nick an addict in recovery, the movie basically says his obsession with Gatsby wasn't just some weird friendship. No, it was an addiction. Gatsby was the drug. Nick was addicted to the past, to the hope, to this man who was everything he both admired and, kind of hated.
Okay, so if the whole movie is supposed to be a fever dream, how does that actually, look and sound on screen? Well, Luhrmann tries to translate the feeling of Fitzgerald's writing through two of his most debated and, let's be honest, controversial choices, the floating text and that modern soundtrack.
Yeah, he literally puts Fitzgerald's words right there on the screen, floating around in 3D. And people were really split on this. For some, it was a brilliant way to honor the real star of the novel, which is the language itself. But for others, well, it felt kind of like a high-budget PowerPoint presentation, It was constantly just reminding you, hey, you're watching an adaptation of a very, very famous book.
But look, nothing, and I mean nothing, was more jarring for people than the soundtrack. Instead of, the Charleston or other period-accurate music, we get Jay-Z and Beyoncé and Lana Del Rey. So you gotta ask, what was the point? Why put hip-hop smack dab in the middle of the Roaring '20s?
This gets to a really cool idea, emotional fidelity. See, for us, today, 1920s jazz sounds kind of quaint, right? It's old-timey. But back then, it was rebellious, it was dangerous, sexy, and radically new. So the theory is Luhrmann used hip-hop to make us, a modern audience, feel that same disruptive, system-shaking energy that jazz had a century ago. It's not about being historically accurate, it's about being emotionally true.
So this whole fever dream approach doesn't just affect the style, it totally reshapes the story's central characters, Gatsby and Daisy. And it kind of sands down their sharpest, most complicated edges.
In the book, Fitzgerald calls Gatsby an elegant young roughneck, and that's perfect. There's this real danger bubbling just under the surface of his perfect smile. But the movie, with Leonardo DiCaprio, really leans into the tragic romantic hero angle. His criminal stuff gets kind of downplayed, and his vulnerability gets turned way up. We end up with a Gatsby we kind of want to hug, not one we should probably be a little afraid of. And then there's Daisy. The movie makes one single tiny omission that completely changes everything about her character. Her daughter Pammy, she's basically cut from the story. Now, this is huge, because in the book, that little girl is the living, breathing proof that you can't repeat the past. She's a real consequence of Daisy's life with Tom. So when you take her out of the picture, Daisy becomes less of this complex, careless woman who's trapped by her own choices, and she becomes more of a
a fragile prize, just something for two powerful men to fight over. It really robs her of her agency.
Okay, so we've got a new narrator, a new style, new versions of the main characters. So how does this all come together? Let's look at how it completely reshapes the story's absolutely devastating climax.
All right, that big showdown at the Plaza Hotel. In the book, Tom just dismantles Gatsby with his words, and Gatsby just kind of shrinks. But the movie makes it physical. Gatsby absolutely explodes. He grabs Tom, full-on violent rage. And it's a very cinematic choice, right? It gives Daisy a visceral, visual reason to back away. In that moment, she sees that the guy promising her an escape is just as brutal as the guy she's trying to escape from.
And this other choice really drives home what the movie's trying to do. See, in the book, Gatsby's dad shows up at his funeral. It grounds Gatsby in this humble, real past. Luhrmann? He cuts that completely. By erasing his origins, the film keeps Gatsby as this pure myth, an enigma, right to the end. And so the tragedy becomes less about the failure of the American dream and more about Nick's own personal, devastating loss.
So in the end, Luhrmann's movie isn't really trying to be the book. It's trying to capture the feeling of reading the book, the feeling of it as a memory, dizzying, intoxicating, beautiful, and in the end, a total nightmare that you just can't escape.
And all of this leaves us with one big question. What does an adaptation really owe its source material? Does it owe a perfect, literal copy, faithful to every single word? Or does it owe an emotional truth, translating the soul of the story for a new time and a new medium, even if that means you have to break all the rules to get there?